Hello, this is Gary Leland, and you're listening to episode 118 of the Crypto Cousins podcast.
Feed your interest in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies by joining Hall of Fame podcaster Gary Leland on the Crypto Cousins podcast. And remember, we are all cousins in the world of crypto. This week's price of Bitcoin.
$9,382. That's up $48 or 0.5% over the last 7 days. Howdy, howdy, howdy. Welcome to the Crypto Cousins podcast. Hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Everything's well. Bitcoin is holding. That's well. But on today's show, I'm going to bring you a session by Jimmy Song from the 2019 BitBlockBoom conference that I held here in Dallas, Texas. Now, just in case you are not aware of it, I want to make sure you know about it, and that's a BitBlockBoom conference. I call it a real Bitcoin conference, and let me tell you why. I call it that because that's all we talk about is Bitcoin. No altcoins, not blockchain. We really talk about Bitcoin and only Bitcoin. It's a bunch of Bitcoin maximalists for the most part. So if you're interested in Bitcoin, this is a great conference to come to. The third BitBlockBoom Bitcoin conference is going to be held again in Dallas in August of 2020. We're going to have a ton of great speakers. Take a look at our lineup. And if you decide to go, use the code COUSINS, that's COUSINS at checkout, and you can get 30% off the price of your ticket. Okay, and that's at bitblockboom.com. Now, as I said earlier, today's episode is a session by Jimmy Song. And in case you're not familiar with Jimmy, he's a Bitcoin educator, a developer, an entrepreneur. He has 2 books he's written, Programming Bitcoin and the Little Bitcoin Book. And I'll have links to both of those books in the show notes. In this session, Jimmy delivers a thought-provoking presentation on how Bitcoin changes incentives at the individual, company, national, and global levels, and the audience follow with informative questions. So let's take a listen.
My presentation is titled How Bitcoin Changes Incentives, and I wanted to make this presentation because I wanted to think about how things change. And I think in your bulletin it's something like how Bitcoin changes our mental model. And they're kind of similar things, but really as I thought more about this topic, it occurred to me that a lot of the incentives that we have in the current system, they're kind of bad. They're very sinister. And in examining it, I came to the conclusion that there's a lot just to think about in terms of the current incentives and how Bitcoin fixes all of it. So anyway, I'm going to go through this in sort of 4 stages, starting sort of at the lowest level. We're going to start at the level of the individual. And from there, we're going to go to the level of companies. Like it or not, that happens to be what we're all organized into. You know, when you meet someone, you first ask them, where do you work? And not necessarily, what tribe they're from or something like that. Then we'll go on to the next level, which is nations, and then finally the world, like the global community, and how that's all affected. Anyway, let's get into the individual level and what the current system is like and what the incentives are. A lot of this is going to be kind of familiar to you, but in many ways it's a lot like fish and water, right? Like fish don't know that they're swimming in water. And it's only when they're lacking water that they kind of realize it. In the same way, a lot of this is sort of very familiar to us, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. So first thing I want to point out is that there is currently no real easy way to store value, right? In the current system, it's based on Keynesian economics, and for Keynesian economics, it's required that money flow through the system. If there's any place that the money can get parked, it's not flowing through the system. So they've made it purposefully difficult to store value anywhere. In fact, about the only and the reason why you can't just keep it in dollars is because of the inflation that's going on. And inflation is not CPI, right? The classical definition of inflation is the amount of the supply of something that increases every year. And if you look at the M2 money supply for the US dollar, from 1959, this is taken straight from the St. Louis Fed, to now it's increased by a multiple of 51, which is an insane number, right? Multiple of 51 over the last 60 years. And if you annualize that, that's something around 6.7%. Now, the other two stores of value, the two stores of value that are kind of available are real estate and stocks, right? Real estate and stocks. Now, I mean, never mind like the insane transaction costs and the friction that comes along with those two. The fact of the matter is that if you invested in either of those things and you're getting 6.7%, that's considered pretty good, right? That tells you that we are all really just kind of running to stay in the same place. That's essentially what this whole system is made to do. You have to work hard in order to keep the value that you have. And that's a big insight about the individual level. There's no real good place to store value because of the overlords, the economists, the people that are in power. They want you to keep running to stay in the same place. And how a lot of other people react is that, you know, if it's that hard to store value, this is what they're going to do, right? You don't need to store value if there is no value, right? If you don't have anything of value, well, then you don't need to store it. So they end up spending, they end up consuming, they end up doing whatever floats their boat for the moment, and they have very high time preference behavior as a result of the fact that there is no good place to store value. And how does Bitcoin fix this? Well, Bitcoin fixes it because there is now a good store of value. And when you have that, your behavior starts to change, especially at the individual level. All right, so another consequence is that because there's a very, storing value is very hard, the people that actually have money, well, they spend a ton of time trying to store their value instead of creating value. And this is a major detriment to society and civilization in general. Because, if you know any rich people, you know that they spend a lot of time in due diligence, right? They're trying to look for the right property to invest in. They're trying to look for the right stock to invest in. Which mutual fund should I buy? Which bond should I buy? Which thing should I get? This is all time that is spent not creating. And it's not anything productive because the same research that you end up doing, somebody else is going to do again because they don't trust, right? Like, you can have like bond rating agencies or whatever, but we know how corrupt those things can get. So essentially what ends up happening is that all of these people that have all this productive capacity, that have all this wealth, instead of creating value, they're striving and running to stay in the same place that they are. That's what ends up happening. And, as a result of all this, we get all kinds of insanity, right? Like, we get insane asset inflation, right? The first three are like a New York taxi cab medallion, a Michael Jordan rookie card, and a Rothko painting. Those things are, have some utility, but they have a value far beyond the utility that that should be there, in part because people want to store value somewhere. And you get some insane asset inflation. You have modern art, right? There's a book like the $12 million shark. Some guy stuffed a shark and sold it for $12 million. It's insane that sort of thing is happening. It's because there's no good place to store value. So fine art becomes this thing where, okay, maybe this will happen. And the thing about stores of value is that it gives a perception that you are just lucky, right? Because if you store, most stores of value are not fungible at all. If you're looking at like real estate or different stocks or something like that, because of their lack of fungibility, somebody that gets lucky with a particular part of real estate, right? You happen to have owned something in San Francisco like 20 years ago versus somebody in Iowa. I mean, you're going to have made a lot more money as somebody that owned property in San Francisco. That just happens to be luck. It's not distributed in any sort of fair way, or it's more cynically done because of the powers that be. Other stuff that happens is that materialism, grows because, well, I don't have a way to store value. Might as well, do something flashy with it. That is a Chanel handbag where the chain is made out of diamonds. I still remember like 20 years ago, the most expensive handbag you could get was like $1,000. Now it's like $100,000, right? Something has happened. Similar thing with cars, right? That's a Bugatti. And it used to be like the most expensive car you could get was like $300,000. Now it's like well over $1 million. It's crazy. And that's kind of what happens. And finally, that last picture is of a rapper eating a $1,500 donut, right? That's a $1,500 gold leaf covered donut. This is what people do when there's no store of value. They need some flashy way to show off, right? This is what having no good store of value does to people, is that it makes them like essentially very shallow, like consuming and showing off and doing things like that. Ultimately, the big problem here is that instead of reaching for the stars, right, like trying to create something new, everyone is absolutely more concerned with protecting their downside because there is no good store of value. And this is not just true in the United States, but all over the world. This is a much bigger deal because things can go south so quickly and things can get so bad so quickly that you have to find places to put money. And you see this all the time. You see this with people in China, right? They're buying up property in Vancouver and Toronto and wherever they can find it, because that's a hard asset. That's not going to lose value. And we saw with the Chinese yuan, right? Like that's degrading in value. So that was actually a very good move to go buy real estate. And this is what happens when you don't have a good store of value, is that really the rich people get richer. That's essentially what's been happening. So that's at the individual level. So let's take a look at the level above that. And that's, like I said, that's at the level of companies. And that's sort of how we're organized right now. It's not really by tribe anymore, or even ethnic group or anything like that. It's by whatever company you happen to be working for. The big thing about companies is that there's a Cantillon effect, and if you don't know what that is, it's basically that the first users of the newly printed money get all of the benefits. And that means that companies that have access to cheap loans get to benefit a lot more instead of the smaller companies. And that's had some tremendous consequences for civilization. So among other things, it means some serious debt-fueled growth. And if you're a large company, you have access to loans that are very, very cheap. If you think about it, the central bank makes a lot more loans available to their member banks. Most of their member banks that do loans are actually commercial banks. And if you're a commercial bank, you can lend, say you have $200 million to lend. You can either lend $200 million to one company, or you can make $102 million loans to 100 small companies. Which are you going to do? It's a no-brainer, right? You're going to do the $200 million. In fact, you take a discount, right, and make less money, just so you don't have all that paperwork and due diligence that you'd have to do. So all of that debt gets pushed to these large companies. And what do they do with that money? Well, if you're smart and you're a pretty decent company, what are you going to do? Well, you could undercut your competition. All those small companies, you're just going to undercut them until they go out of business and then raise prices. Or you can lobby for government regulation so that it's difficult for them. Or, barring all of that, you can just go use that money to do a buyout of the companies that are the most innovative. This means that the big companies get even bigger, and the small companies have to basically fight uphill, right? They have to run to stay in the same place, whereas the large companies, they get to, get access to all this debt-fueled growth. In fact, that sort of mentality has trickled down even to, like college students, right? They're doing debt-fueled growth in a way, and this is what ends up happening, is that they have a lifetime of debt thinking that they can do that same thing. Anyway, all of this results in a winner-take-all company, winner-take-all economy, and like the people that know this the most are venture capitalists. They know what the deal is. They know that if you get past a certain level of size, that you're going to have a massive advantage over everyone else. So it is growth at all costs. This is where the whole unicorn meme comes from with respect to venture capital, is that they want billion-dollar companies. Why? Because you have an advantage at $1 billion that you do not have in this economy at any smaller level. And it is an almost like unbelievably large advantage that if you can get to that level, you are going to stay there for a very long time, because there are all sorts of ways in which the state supports you and all sorts of interdependency and fragility that we'll talk about. But this is very obvious to anyone that's a VC, right? Like they don't fund small companies. Why? Well, because they're searching for unicorns. They know that this is where the sweet spot in the economy is. And really, the big thing to note is that there's an emphasis on size and not on innovation. Right? It's not about creating new things anymore. This economy, the way this whole system is set up, is to encourage bigger and bigger things. And I love this cartoon because here's a guy like that's trying to innovate something, and he's like, oh well, I could just whip them harder. That's essentially what the innovation in companies ends up being, is getting more out of their workers instead of actually innovating new products. The coordination problem in large companies tends to do that. So that's companies. We've covered the individual level, the company level. Now let's get to the nation level. And this is where a lot of the problems that if you're a libertarian you know about already. But first of all, there's a pretty major moral hazard, right? Like if you are the entity that's in charge and could create a budget, and you can also print money, and you have a giant moral hazard. You might print money for yourself. You might print money for your cronies. You might print money for stuff that you want and not necessarily what the population wants. And it is a giant moral hazard, and that leads to everything in government being completely disconnected from price, right? Like they don't care how much things cost. So I talked recently with a few people that work with the healthcare website. Do you guys remember this? How much of a disaster that was? So apparently the government, in all its wisdom, decided to spend $700 million to pay a contractor to make the website. And they had all these requirements. It took them 18 months to do it. And at the end of the 18 months, everyone found out very spectacularly that the website did not work. It couldn't scale past 50 users, which is horrible, right? And so what happened was Todd Park, CTO of the United States, he flew out to Silicon Valley and talked to a couple of Google engineers and said, you know what, your country needs you. Can you come help us out? They came in. They fixed a few of the problems, and they said, you know what, like, we're going to have to rebuild this thing. And so they hired some of their friends and rebuilt the whole thing. It took them 9 weeks and $10 million. 9 weeks and $10 million. Why did it take 70 times less money, right, and 8 times less time with much, much fewer people to get that done, right? The government does not care about price at all, because, and like to some degree this is true of any government, but because they have the ability to print money, they'll do whatever they want, essentially. And all these bureaucrats don't care about price. They care more about climbing up the ladder of bureaucracy or something like that. The crazy thing is, though they only spent $10 million on it, what I found out was that Congress at that time was so embarrassed that they were willing to put in another $200 million if necessary to get that thing done. Doesn't that tell you something about how broken everything is? Anyway, some of the other things that happen as a result is that the government ends up with a larger purview. And you probably know this quote from Spider-Man: with great power comes great responsibility. Yeah, and certainly money, the ability to print money is great responsibility. Great power. So that comes with it a great responsibility. And the typical thing is, well, the government needs to do something about this. And there's no real good answer to it when you have fiat money. because, well, the government needs to pay for my lung cancer. And it's, well, I mean, if you have the moral, if you have the ability to fix that, why wouldn't you? I mean, never mind that you've been smoking for 30 years and that a lot of that is your fault, right? Like there's no real limit to the government anymore. And that gives them a moral imperative to do something. And of course, because of the bureaucracy, this is what ends up happening. Yes, we can fix that, except we probably won't because we're pretty incompetent. Anyway, the whole system, because of the giant companies that exist and because of the inefficiencies of government, it's currently set up to support a lot of these large companies. If you think about it, a large portion of the banking system pumps money into the big companies so that they can grow larger, that they can eliminate competition and so on. Even the education system, right? Like it's churning out cogs for big companies instead of you get a degree as an accountant or something, right? Like, and it's a cog that can fit in, many different company machines. That's how the whole system is currently designed. And of course, government regulation, they're designed to protect these things. And it's not because they're being evil per se. It's because the entire economy is dependent on these large companies. So if you let any of them fall, then, dominoes start falling and you might have great suffering and depression. It's a very fragile system. Anyway, we've looked at things at the individual level. We looked at the things from the company level. We looked at things from the nation level. Well, now let's go to sort of the more broad scope global level. And the first thing to recognize in the global level is right now we're under a dollar hegemony. And this is something that not a lot of people know. I'm sure a lot of you guys in this room know. But we've been under a dollar hegemony since about 1944 with Bretton Woods. And this is, I like to tell people that there were two superpowers after World War II. One decided to control their sphere of influence through violence, the other through markets, kind of. So Soviet Union obviously, invaded rebelling countries and put in puppet dictators and so on. I mean, not that the US didn't do some of that either. But mainly it was through the dollar hegemony. And it was through forcing other central banks to keep dollars in reserve and making the dollar the standard, the unit of settlement in international trade. So essentially the unit of account for the entire world became the US dollar. And most central banks to this day try to keep their currency within a certain range of the US dollar for trade purposes. And of course, after 1971, when Nixon broke the tie with gold and changed to the petrodollar, this has meant a lot of endless war in the Middle East that's sort of still persisting. We're still in Iraq, still in Afghanistan. That combined with being completely disconnected from price due to being able to print whatever money they want has meant a lot of devastation in that region. But more than that, there's a global Cantillon effect, and we talked about this earlier. The first printers of that money get most of its benefits. And we have to be honest here, right? Even though we're in the US, a lot of the prosperity that we have is on the backs of people all over the world. Right? A lot of the inflation that we have goes to those countries via the treasuries that they buy. And then those countries inflate, and those poor suckers at the end, in the poor countries, they suffer the most. And this is why the poor countries, they hyperinflate much faster. And it's a sad situation. Because it's not a level playing field. Like where you were born matters a significant amount to what you're able to achieve, and that's the whole system, right? It's completely interdependent. It's completely fragile, and there's a lot of ways in which a small thing happening could cause a domino effect that crushes the whole thing. But here's the good news. Bitcoin fixes this. Bitcoin fixes it all, right? See, Bitcoin changes the incentives for every level. At the individual level, now you have a good store of value. That means that you don't have to run to stand still. You can think about new ways to make money, new innovations that you can make that better civilization. And companies won't be, just taking advantage of the cheap loans that they get and doing debt-fueled growth. Instead, they have to actually save up to grow, right? And nations, they're not going to cater their entire system to these large companies. It's going to be much more limited and budget conscious. And at the global level, you're not going to have this global Cantillon effect. You're not going to have the dollar hegemony. You're going to instead have a much more level playing field. And that means that people living everywhere can do something that they can add value to civilization. And this is how Bitcoin changes incentives. Bitcoin fixes all of this stuff. Bitcoin makes it so that we don't have to run to stay in the same place. We're not on a treadmill. See, all of that running is keeping the current system alive. We have to do that in order to circulate money, in order to keep the people in power that are in power, and so on. Like that cartoon I showed you earlier, we're essentially moving those large stones and benefiting the people that are in power that get to print the money, that get to do all of these things. The Nouriel Rabinis of the world, they get to benefit off of our backs, and that's what Bitcoin fixes.
I hope you enjoyed that. Did you know Jimmy's been on our show, I think, more than anybody? I think maybe this is the 7th time he's been on the show, something of his. So he's the man. But before I go, I want to make sure everybody knows that I am operating a Lightning node. In case you have a Lightning node, I'm looking to open channels with all you cousins out there. So if you have a node, open a channel to my node. And of course, I'll open one back. And my channel or my node is Crypto Cousins. That's one word, Crypto Cousins. So that should make it easy to find. If you have trouble, just hit me up on Twitter. At the moment, I'm up to 21 channels open, so I'm moving along rather quickly. So hopefully you'll send me your channel and we'll open one up today. A big thank you to all the cousins out there that are showing their support by donating, subscribing, and leaving great reviews on iTunes. All of those things help more than you realize. Now you can subscribe almost anywhere podcasts are available by going to cryptocousin.com/subscribe. Call me with your comments or questions at 747-777-9471. Or you can email me at thecryptocousins@gmail.com, and I'll try to use these on future episodes. Please take a peek at the 4-Minute Crypto Show, which is produced every weekday and located at 4minutecrypto.com. It's the place to get your daily dose of crypto news, and as always, 4 minutes or less. And one last thing, please take a look at my new website, Crypto Crybaby. This website is for the true crypto fan and sells Bitcoin and crypto gear like t-shirts, caps, and so much more. Take a look at CryptoCrybaby.com today. Thanks again for listening. Love you guys.
Thanks for listening to the Crypto Cousins podcast. Please share the show with your friends. They can subscribe by going to cryptocousins.com/subscribe. And if you want to know more about Gary, just go to GaryLeland.com. Make sure and join Gary and all the Crypto Cousins every week for a new episode of the Crypto Cousins podcast. The Crypto Cousins podcast and the information included in the podcast are not intended as investment advice. Investing in any cryptocurrency is risky, and you should never invest more than you can afford to lose. Always seek professional advice before investing in any cryptocurrency. Please understand, you are using any and all information from the Crypto Cousins at your own risk.